Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Holistic Health Radio. I'm your host, Sarah Liz King. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Stefanie Valakas. Stefanie is an expert fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of the Dietologist. Stefanie and her virtual practice are dedicated to excellence in nutrition for reproductive health, fertility, and pregnancy. Her passion for nutrition in this space has truly grown from her own experience, helping clients online from around the world and also through her own personal experiences of navigating a diagnosis of endometriosis. You can learn more about how to work with Stefanie and the Dietologist team by clicking all of the links in the show notes. A big warm welcome to the podcast. Well, I should say back to the podcast. Stefanie, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you, Sarah? Thanks for having me.
I am so good. Now, for those of you who may have missed our first podcast episode that Stefanie and I have done together, I'll be sure to link that in the show notes as well. But today we are kind of discussing postpartum amenorrhea, how to get your periods back after having a baby. But before we dive into that, I always like asking my guests a few fun get to know you questions. These ones will be similar, but also a little bit different to the ones I've asked you before. The first one is, what is your coffee order?
Skinny latte.
Ooh. Are you a one a day kind of gal, or you have multiple in a day?
Oh, more than one. I'm a 2 to 3 at the moment. The third has snuck in because it's like iced latte season here in Sydney, and
Yeah.
it just hits different when it's 2 o'clock, and you need the little pep in your step for the afternoon. You get it. And I am that girly that just shakes the ice. I shake the ice, I walk and I shake the ice. And it's like the sound of summer to me is the ice in the cup shaking. I love it.
I feel like whenever I'm drinking hot coffee, like I'll stop at about 2. If it's
Yeah.
iced coffee, I feel like I could have about 10. Like
Yeah.
there is no limit, which is kind of
There's no
bad
limit.
because the productivity goes from being really productive to just being like a little bit jittery, and then it doesn't really help you that much.
And then down we go. Yeah,
And
I
down we go.
always regret the third because when I'm lying in bed, wide awake, wired but tired at like 11:30 p.m., I go, oh, what's the iced latte worth it? And then I do the same thing the next day. So look, do as I say, not as I do.
Well, for some things, yeah.
Yeah.
We are kind of good role models in some respects, but also human beings in others. So coffee, I would say, is definitely sometimes my downfall. Sometimes I'm balanced. What is something that we can always find in your fridge?
Ooh, feta cheese. Always.
Ooh, okay. What's your favorite thing to make with feta cheese?
It touches many of the foods that I eat in my life. I
Yeah.
can't have avocado toast without feta. I can't have salad without feta. I can't have an omelette without feta. I make spinach pie with feta.
Tell me you're Greek without telling me you're
Yeah,
Greek.
it's just being Greek. And I have a saying, everything is better with a little bit of feta, and it's true. Like, it just is so much better.
Hands down, I'll take your word for it. I mean, you can make me avocado toast any day and I will take the feta on top.
Oh, it's so good.
What is something that you're really grateful for today?
I am really grateful for my friends today. It's been a week of checking in with my friends and being there for them. And I'm grateful that when I need them to be there for me, they always are. So, yeah, grateful for my friends.
We got your back.
Yeah.
Outside of Stefanie and I being colleagues, we are also besties beyond the Instagram scene, which is really lovely.
We sure are.
Now, for anyone that may not know who you are and a little bit about what you do, obviously I gave a small amount of information in the intro, but do you want to give the listeners a little bit more of a background about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a reproductive health, fertility and pregnancy dietitian and nutritionist, and I run the Dietologist. We are a fully telehealth nutrition practice. We see clients from all over Australia, and we focus exclusively on this arena of reproductive health. So we see lots of people with PCOS, endometriosis, thyroid dysfunction, HA, as well as people who are trying to conceive. Navigating fertility treatments is a really common presentation that we see. And then we get the delightful joy of following them into pregnancy and beyond, which is always such a thrill for us. And I got into this arena kind of, I always say, ass backwards, because I was actually a children's dietitian many years ago. And I loved being a pediatric dietitian, but I did start to notice that a lot of my patients who were coming in with nutrition related concerns, I could track back a lot of what was going on in kids into what mum was eating in pregnancy, what mum and dad were doing pre-pregnancy. And it really re-sparked my passion for genetics, physiology, and microbiology, which I all majored in at university. And I went back and did some extra studying and professional development in the space of preconception and fertility nutrition and pregnancy nutrition, and got home and felt like I can't not do this. Like, I have to do this. No one was really doing it at the time. And I just felt like there was such a need and for a dedicated space and profession for, you know, the 1 in 7 women that have endometriosis, the 1 in 20 women that have PCOS, the 1 in 6 couples that face infertility, the millions of pregnant people. Like, I just felt like there needed to be something dedicated, not just going to see any regular old dietitian. And yeah, the Dietologist was kind of born after that. So yeah, that's a bit about how I got into this space, and my passion for it is driven through a variety of different reasons, some of which being including my own health. I think I've always been a little bit, you know, if you talk to a lot of midwives, a bit pregnancy or baby obsessed, or obsessed at least with that life stage. And I just find it so fascinating. I love the science of it, and I love I love working with women as well. I just, and such a motivated group of women, especially, who are really wanting to work towards those goals. And yeah, I also love the fact that I was going to have this intergenerational impact. I was going to impact the next generation from before they were even conceived, and whilst they were being grown in their mums' tummies, and potentially even grandchildren too. So yeah, I was really inspired to get to the root of preventative health, and yeah, ended up in that preconception space.
And honestly, you are, in my eyes, the go-to expert. Anyone that is working with me who recovers from HA and wants to go beyond to get pregnant and have a healthy pregnancy, Stefanie is always who I send them to, because although I have some knowledge, she is definitely the expert. And I think it's so important to collaborate with colleagues and make sure that, you know, the people that we're looking after are getting the best care, the best support, the best evidence-based advice possible. And when it comes to, you know, sometimes like your rainbow baby, like making
Yeah.
sure that child has every opportunity to thrive in utero and then beyond in childhood into adulthood is, yeah, such an amazing impact to have. Now, today specifically, we're talking about the postpartum period of life, and about periods postpartum, because I specifically see some women who come to me and they're like, oh, is this just normal postpartum amenorrhea, or have I slipped into hypothalamic amenorrhea? How do I tell the difference? So we're going to be having a little bit of a discussion around that today. But Stefanie, I kind of wanted for you to touch on, is it common for periods to be delayed or irregular postpartum?
Extremely common. In fact, expected. Um, so something called lactational amenorrhea, which is the suppression of your period and usually then ovulation as well, due to the fact that you are breastfeeding, usually is the main reason why this would occur. And those high levels of prolactin, which create breast milk and tell your body to breastfeed, is what is at play when it comes to actually slowing down and stopping the cycle from returning. And it's really an evolutionary response for the body to try and preserve energy. If we think about it, if we're breastfeeding, you actually have higher energy and nutrient demands. You're more sleep deprived in that postpartum period. And so the body shuts down that cycle to conserve energy and also prevent you from getting pregnant again. It's an unreliable form of contraception and we wouldn't recommend it. But certainly historically, that's how pregnancies would be able to be spaced accordingly. And so we are now, in my work as well, I see a lot of people who want to have children in close succession for a variety of factors, but typically due to age and fertility concerns or having a long journey to trying to conceive. And so, might take 2 or 3 years again to have another baby. And so often preparations for a subsequent child start very early, and there's a lot of frustration when your period or ovulation isn't reinstating as quickly as you thought it might. So it is very common, but I also appreciate the frustration if you are in that position of wanting to start to try for another baby, or if you've had a history of HA and you have this absence of your menstrual cycle postpartum, it can really wind you back and think, oh my God, have I slipped back into some old habits or some old patterns, and this is actually HA, and it's hard to know what is what.
Yeah, yeah. So, differentiating between the two, like you said, can be really, really tricky. And obviously, there's going to be, I guess, a range of factors that go into a person's periods, menstrual cycle, and ovulation returning postpartum. But can you give us an idea of how long it typically takes for menstrual cycles to return and normalize after childbirth?
Yeah. So it is very dependent on whether you exclusively breastfeed, you pump, you mix feed, or you formula feed. Typically, the first 6 or so weeks after you deliver, you will expect some postpartum bleeding. It is typically not defined as your period. This is bleeding that is occurring due to birth, and that's typical whether you have a C-section or a vaginal delivery. So that part isn't considered your quote-unquote period. That's more your postpartum bleeding, which is what you would expect. If that is much lighter or much heavier than your obstetrician has expected, then it's time to check in with your doctor about that. Usually at that 6-week appointment postpartum, when you go and visit your GP or obstetrician, they'll have a conversation with you about the likelihood of your period returning and what measures you'd want to take, whether that be contraception or not. And they usually then have a discussion around, family planning, if you would like future children, which is a bit of a confronting conversation 6 weeks after you've just had a baby and you're probably feeling quite fatigued. But it is an important conversation to be having, and especially depending on the way that you birth, there can be some limitations to then, proximity to a vaginal delivery after you have a C-section, all those kinds of things. So the spacing is quite relevant. So typically then that's a conversation that you have then. On average, I would say the first year, if you are breastfeeding, is typically quite unpredictable with your period. And I can't seem to find in having many conversations with clients any kind of average or normal. I have seen people, reinstate their period straight away. And I've also seen people who may go up to 2 years whilst breastfeeding, not having a regular cycle or a cycle at all. Now, whether there's underlying other issues at play, that's then what we have to question. But there is no normal, which is challenging, because then you end up at mum's group and asking other women when they got their period, and then you start to feel like maybe I'm not normal or something's wrong, or am I pregnant again, or what's going on. So it's totally understandable that there's this need and desire to be normal. Everyone wants that part of it, but I am yet to find something that's quote unquote average or normal. It is just so wide ranging. And some people just have the type of period that will come hell or high water, and other people don't. So it is quite individual in that regard.
Yeah. And you mentioned that obviously exclusively breastfeeding versus pump versus formula can have an impact on obviously the energy requirements that your body has and potentially how long it takes to recover your periods postpartum.
Absolutely.
In your experience, or to your knowledge, are there any other specific factors that might influence a person's time to their first periods, like anything during pregnancy or after pregnancy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a few things. Number one is the total amount of time spent breastfeeding and the spacing in which you are breastfeeding. That is quite important and relevant, because sometimes those dips in the breaks might be sufficient to help with hormonal signals to kick you over into ovulating. So that's one thing to think about if you are breastfeeding. And I have a great podcast episode, not to plug my own podcast, but there is a really great podcast episode that I recorded with another dietitian who's a real nerd about this area. And it's about trying to conceive whilst breastfeeding. She goes into quite a lot of detail about how to manipulate breastfeeding to try and reinstate ovulation, which is above what I know. So I would recommend checking that out if that's of interest to you. But other things are that women in the postpartum period are really great at looking after their babies and not so great at looking after themselves. And so what can happen is you are on your 9th piece of Vegemite toast for the day and you haven't really eaten a balanced meal in, a week. And that's an artifact of the demands of early parenthood. And I totally acknowledge that. However, I try and build systems for clients so that we don't rely on just whatever you can stuff into your face, because this then creates an energy deficit that can sometimes be too large and can exacerbate any underlying propensity to have a bit of hypothalamic amenorrhea or energy deficit related amenorrhea. So that's something that I work on with my clients actually during pregnancy, is postpartum preparation and setting the expectation of actually how much food they need to be eating, especially if they choose to breastfeed. Or can breastfeed, not even choose to breastfeed. You know what I mean? But
yeah,
the energy requirements are above that of what we see in third trimester. And most people are pretty shocked to find that out. We need a lot more fluid. We need a lot more actual energy. We need a lot more carbohydrates. We need a lot more starchy vegetables. The protein requirement drops a lot. So that makes room for more of those types of foods. And we need to be taking our postnatal vitamins. All those things are important and relevant. So that's one component of it. And I think getting that right, especially for your listeners, is really important. And it is really easy, and it is the default not to pay attention to this, because you are tired and you are time poor and you are going to just reach for that comfort thing or that convenience thing or whatever your status quo is. Like for me, it's avocado toast with feta on it, that would be my status quo thing if I don't know what I'm doing, because I always have avocado, I always have feta, I always have bread, and I get that, and that's okay. That's better than not eating anything at all. But over time, those things accumulate and can cause an issue. There's also a whole range of other things that can occur independent of being postpartum, but coincidentally kind of synchronized to this period of time. So, for example, you may have a thyroid concern. About 10% of women up to will have something called postpartum thyroiditis. This is a reaction to the fact that baby is now out, but the thyroid doesn't behave like the baby's out. So it doesn't regulate its function back down. So you then are left with an overactive thyroid. And it's a bit like I tell people, it's a bit like being on speed. Everything gets sped up. So, and I have no personal experience with this. But from working with clients who have hyperactive thyroids or overactive thyroids, what we see is a quickening of things. Your thoughts will race. You'll feel more anxious. You'll feel hot. You will lose weight without even trying. And because in this postpartum window, a lot of times weight loss naturally occurs because, you probably just delivered a few kilos of a baby and your uterus is going to shrink down and the fluid is gone and your blood volume is going to regulate back to normal. It gets masked by that. And so marked weight loss often goes unflagged or sometimes in society applauded. And so that is a common cover-up, and that's a problem. The other symptoms include things like diarrhea and so on. And so if you do have an overactive thyroid, you can sometimes have an interference in ovulation and menstruation as well. So that's something to think about. There's also a group of people that fall on the other side of the spectrum, have underactive thyroids, and you just put all those symptoms in reverse. Lower mood, slower digestion, sluggishness, feeling cold, and again, you can have menstrual disturbances as well. And then other things can come up, coincidentally, sometimes people, didn't know or didn't have before, and now they have PCOS or they have another type of condition. They have HA. They have, so there's so many things that can come up. And just because it didn't come up for you before you got pregnant doesn't mean it's not relevant now. And I think that's a thing that I see a lot of people fall into the trap of, is like, you think that your health status goes back to the way it was preconception after you have a baby. It's a whole, like, you were birthed to a new version of yourself when you delivered your baby. And so your health is different now. It's not to say that it's what happened to you before is irrelevant, but it's probably not ever going to be identically the same. And so I think that's a common trap that a lot of people do. I just do what I did before and it'll be fine. And sometimes that's not the case at all.
And I think this really just speaks to the fact that there are so many factors that can influence our health postpartum and also our periods postpartum. And if you have that gut instinct that something feels not quite right, the best thing is to go and get it checked out. I think part of the problem is, like some things get swept under the rug because obviously you're quite fatigued, you may not be eating as well, but I think most people know if they're not feeling themselves to use that as motivation to go and speak with your doctor, your gynecologist, and really get those tests run so you can get deeper understanding of whether it's something to be concerned of or over or not. Is better safe than sorry in these instances. Now, you kind of mentioned in that part of your conversation that being well equipped postpartum with the knowledge of how much you need to be eating and the kinds of foods that can be helpful and to have on hand is really part of what you do in your work leading up to birth. Can you give us some examples of some meals or some handy things that you have talked to your clients about that they have found work really well for themselves in that kind of postpartum, especially kind of like newborn era?
Yeah. I always tell people to start at around 35 weeks pregnant, to start making double of your dinners and freezing them. Do that for between 2 and 6 weeks and you'll have lots of things in the freezer to reheat and eat. The meal that most new mums struggle with is lunch. With dinner, there is typically, for those who have partners, somebody else there that also has to eat. You'll likely put more effort into preparing that meal if you're the person preparing that meal, or someone's going to prepare that meal for you. So you don't really need to think that hard about that. And most new mums are pretty aware that that's the case. It's lunch that typically goes out the window and ends up being, okay, I put the baby down for a nap. Okay, I need to put a load of washing on, call my mum back, I don't know, have a shower, breathe for a second, have a cup of tea, and then the baby's up and you didn't eat lunch. Or, oh my God, I've only got 5 minutes till I need to wake the baby up. What am I going to eat for lunch? Too hard basket, decision fatigue. What am I going to do? and then the like 16th piece of Vegemite toast emerges for the week, you know, like, so
Yeah.
it's all those kinds of things. And I paint that picture for people early on because it is likely going to happen to you. And so I teach my clients not only like why things are important, like I said, carbohydrates and vegetables, because it's got the right amount of energy and you have higher energy demands, and fiber and vitamin C and B vitamins and all this good stuff. Like, yes, okay, you need to have some nutrition knowledge to like understand why you're doing it, but also the practicalities. Okay, let's make sure that the pantry is always stocked with microwave brown rice and quinoa cups. Let's make sure that we have freezer meals for lunches, because then you can just reheat and eat. Let's try and pick a few things from the supermarket and give them a test run as to things that you can just quickly assemble. I have like this whole like assembly meal guide that I give to my clients. I'm like, you can't be bothered, I know, just like literally put these things together and you'll have somewhat of a balanced meal. And the other thing I kind of get my clients to focus on is meals that are a little bit more carb forward. So fried rice, risotto, lasagna, pasta salad, shepherd's pie with lots of mashed potato on top and lentils in the base, all those kinds of things. And all those things you can make bulk. You can make heaps of. Do lots of soups, but make sure they're quite nourishing, not just vegetable and broth. Like put legumes and beans and blend it through and add some protein on top. Don't be afraid of the supermarket roast chicken, like all those kinds of things, so that you've got things on hand. You don't have all the pregnancy food rules anymore. You don't need to worry about listeria and salmonella and, oh my God, I can't eat the mayo and this and that. No, that's fine. You can have all that. The only things you really got to be mindful of is alcohol and mercury and excess amounts of caffeine. So that's the only three things you've got to worry about, which is really a walk in the park after you've been pregnant. So you have much more range, and that's really exciting, but you got to flex the range as well. So leverage the things that you weren't eating before. I couldn't eat smoked salmon before. How convenient is it to have smoked salmon in the fridge? I can pop that on my cream cheese on toast for breakfast with some eggs. Great. And I think as well, like actually having a conversation, if you do have a partner, about how you're actually going to prioritize nourishing yourself during this time. You may need to have them remind you. You may need to have an external person ask you if you've eaten lunch today. Having also some one-handed snacks available as well. Nut bars, bliss balls, pre-cut pieces of fruit, single-serve tubs of yogurt. Yes, it's more packaging. Yes, it's more expensive to buy things single-serve. But honestly, when you're in that phase, like just getting it in your gob is the most important thing. So like don't sweat that kind of stuff. And I think they're like my main thing. Oh, and hydration, like big water bottle, like 6 of them. Put them everywhere. One at your bedside, one in the car, one in the place where you get nap trapped all the time, one in your kids' room, one in the kitchen, because you often find you'll get stuck in places and you will, like, especially if you are breastfeeding, your mouth feels like the Sahara Desert. So thirsty. So, yeah. And honouring those hunger cues, because typically, again, if you are breastfeeding, you will be quite hungry. So that's a pretty normal experience and speaks to the higher energy demands. So not underestimating it and making sure you're shopping enough and all that good stuff. And then the main other sticking point I see is actually not in the early phase, because in the early phase, people are going to bring you the meals. People are like, oh, how are you doing? They're checking in on you. And then when you get to 4 months and your kid's not sleeping because they're going through the 4-month regression, they're not sleeping at all, and you are a wreck.
Yeah.
That's when all hell breaks loose. And that's when, if you don't have systems in place, everything falls on its face. And the other sticking point I also find is when solids start, because then mums are spending all this time in the kitchen, pureeing things, baby-led weaning things, they're flaking the roasted salmon, they're picking the best blueberries from the punnet, they're doing everything for the solids. And then they sit down, their child's eating, they're watching their child eat so they don't gag and they don't choke and this and that, and then they've got to get them ready for the nap. And then, oh my God, it's 3 o'clock and I haven't eaten anything today.
Yeah.
And that's no good either. Whether you're breastfeeding or not, that's not going to help you. So I also, when solids come to the party, I always say what's good for your baby is probably good for you. You can probably create a mum version of what you are spending a lot of time on in the kitchen. You're not
Yeah.
sitting there boiling broccoli 4 times a day. You make a batch, you puree it, you freeze it. Or you make a batch, you put it in a Tupperware, you put it in the fridge. You can do the same thing for yourself. It takes hardly any extra effort and time if you're already doing it for your child. And then as well, whatever's on mummy's plate is always so much more appetizing at this age. So like it's good to eat the same time, the same similar thing. Even from when I was a children's dietitian, we always advocated for that because it's that positive role modeling behavior as well. So yeah, probably the world's most long-winded answer, but hopefully that's helpful.
But also such a good comprehensive answer. I feel like we spend so much time thinking about how we're like nourishing our body while we're growing our baby. And then
Yep.
we have to remember that, yes, baby still needs a lot of nourishment and a lot of care once they're out in the big wide world. But in order for you to provide that care, you also have to make sure that you're looking after yourself. And I guess it comes back to basics and making sure that you have good nutrition for yourself, making sure that you're eating enough. It might be like inconvenient, it might be hard, there might be like new routines that you have to navigate, but it is the most fundamental form of self-care that you need to kind of make sure that you're making time for. And I think it's just a little bit of trial and error, especially for first time
Mm.
parents, to really figure out what's going to work for them, which is why having support is so incredibly crucial because you're already going to be tired. You're going to be having decision fatigue. You're not going to know what to make, which is why having someone to go like, make X, Y, and Z, try X, Y, and Z, buy X, Y, and Z can be
Mm.
so helpful in this process. So that's kind of really, really good to know. And I guess those defining points in baby's life where you kind of see that sticking point of mum not getting enough energy might just like
Mm.
be a little bit of a warning flag for people to look out for if they are in that postpartum journey. And I think mostly, and this is, I guess, my last kind of question, specifically speaking to kind of my audience, is if there are any ways to, I guess, differentiate between whether this is just lactational amenorrhea or postpartum amenorrhea that's quite normal and to be expected, or when we might suspect that actually maybe we're kind of dropping back into hypothalamic amenorrhea if we have had that previously prior to pregnancy.
Yeah. I'm not familiar that with any blood work that would differentiate you, because it would probably look quite similar, um, irrespective of whether, and it's not typical that hormones will get measured at this time because they will be off kilter, for a variety of reasons. So it's then hard to then standardize that and say, well, this is normal, this is what we're aiming for if we're not really screening for it. So I think a really good history with your healthcare provider could give you some clues. And typically people like you and I would be people that can pick up these kinds of red flags, like what I just said, like skipping meals, being very light with meals, trying to exercise a lot, not sleeping doesn't help. Um, those kinds of patterns, we start to then say that maybe it's exacerbating the lactational amenorrhea, certainly, and maybe it's HA as well at the same time, or it's morphed into that.
Mm.
There is it's going to be very grey. There's not going to be this delineation of you had lactational amenorrhea for the first 8 months, and now you have hypothalamic amenorrhea the last 8 months. It probably isn't going to be that black and white. But a good history is certainly like a great starting point. And then those peripheral kind of blood tests that I just mentioned, or conditions to screen for, like thyroid disorders, PCOS, if there's any kind of, and this is like definitely not as common, but I have seen this before, where if you have a C-section in particular, the scar can it kind of cause an adhesion internally, and that can create a structural issue. And then you may be actually building up the lining to shed. but it's not going to come out as easily. So those kinds of things, like you can medically check for as other causes of your amenorrhea. But HA to lactational amenorrhea is very, very, very hard to delineate. And I think it's probably why you will get a lot of wait and see kind of advice typically from medical practitioners of like, let's wait till XYZ time, or let's wait till you drop a feed, or let's wait till you decide to wean, or whatever it is. And I see a lot of people who feel forced, particularly if their desire to regain their period is to try to conceive again, who feel backed against a corner of making a decision as to whether to continue to breastfeed their child or to cease breastfeeding in the hopes of reinstating their period and to try to conceive again for another baby. And it's a really, really hard time for women and a really challenging choice to make. And so I do get a big influx of people pretty desperate to try whatever means necessary to reinstate their period and maintain breastfeeding. It is sometimes possible, but I would say for like that biology part is really hard to surmount. And so then it becomes a more of a personal decision. And it was something that I talked about with in that interview. And it feels ironic because as healthcare professionals, we're all trained to advocate for breastfeeding and to push for it and to support people with it and encourage breastfeeding. And that's incredible. And that's what we should be doing as society. But I also think that this particular scenario does foster then a lot of advice, typically that is just stop breastfeeding then. And so that is so tricky because there is no guarantee that at the moment you stop breastfeeding 1 month later you're going to get your period back either. And so I think you need to tick off all the boxes that you need to tick off before you contemplate those kinds of huge decisions as well. So I mean, it is completely really quite individual in that regard, but eating enough, hydrating yourself enough, just trying to get whatever sleep you practically can, looking after yourself, getting your blood tests done, checking in with your doctor if you're concerned, and then reviewing your breastfeeding plan is, I think, the best place to start. And if you're not breastfeeding and it's been a number of months since you've ceased breastfeeding, or you've not been able to breastfeed, then, I would give it maximum 6 months, and then I would be definitely kicking up a bit of a fuss about getting checked out again. 3 to 6 months, I kind of put it in the same camp as like, how long is abnormal after you come off the pill where you don't get your period back? 3 to 6 months is about like, ooh, something's not right, So it's the same kind of camp. And unless there's another reason why you want to absolutely be reinstating your period, then, we would just let nature do its thing. Otherwise, you can intervene as well. Like you can medically induce your period and so on and so forth. So just depends how much intervention you want, why you want your period back. If you just want that reassurance that it's not HA again, all those kinds of things. So there's lots to factor in there.
So much to factor in. And I think it's such a nuanced conversation and topic, which is, why I wanted to have you on to discuss it, because I feel like, similar to, like you just mentioned before, going off the pill, a lot of the advice we get given is the wait and see. And while that might be pertinent to someone who doesn't feel in a rush for their periods to return, for others, it might be really important. So getting that individualized support and knowing what your options are can be incredibly helpful on this journey. For anyone who would like to connect with you, find out a little bit more about what you do or work with you, what is the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can come and hang out with us on Instagram, which is at @the_dietologist. Our website, which is thedietologist.com.au, which has a fair archive of about 100 plus reference blog articles. So if you love a read, then that's a really great place to start. And then our podcast, Fertility Friendly Food, which you can tune into. We had Sarah on for an episode, so give it a listen. And yeah, we have 100 or so episodes there to go back and listen to. And yeah, I definitely think that Trying to Conceive Whilst Breastfeeding episode would be a great listen and complementary to the conversation we've had today. So if that's something that's on your mind, then I would recommend checking that particular episode out.
Yep. And we'll be sure to grab that link off of you so we can put it in the
shall.
show notes so that people can easily find it and wrap their ears around it. But if you really enjoyed today's episode, feel free to take a screenshot of wherever you're listening. Tag myself at Sarah Liz King or Stefanie at _dietologist. We'll be sure to reshare those on our stories. And of course, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you really enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review. It really helps support the show. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you never miss a future episode. Until next time, keep looking after yourselves, and I will be back next week with a fresh new episode you can wrap your ears around.